When my sister stole my fiancé, she didn't do it quietly or accidentally, but openly and confidently, as if she truly believed that taking something from me was the same as winning it. At the time, I thought the betrayal itself would be the hardest part to survive, never imagining that the aftermath would quietly rearrange everyone's power, status, and future in ways none of us saw coming. I had been engaged for 8 months when everything started to feel slightly off, not dramatic enough to panic over, but unsettling in a way I couldn't explain without sounding paranoid. We had already chosen a date, sent out invitations, and begun planning a future that felt stable and predictable. The kind of life people assume will simply continue once it's set in motion. My sister was around more often during that time, offering help I hadn't asked for and showing interest in details she had never cared about before. She asked questions about our plans, our finances, and my fiancé's work in a way that felt oddly personal, though I brushed it off because she had always been competitive, even when she claimed to be supportive. At family gatherings, I began to notice small shifts that were easy to ignore if I wanted to: lingering looks, private jokes I wasn't part of, and conversations that stopped the moment I entered the room. When I mentioned it to my fiancé, he laughed it off and told me I was imagining things, reassuring me that my sister was just being herself and that stress from wedding planning was getting to me. I trusted him, not because he convinced me, but because I believed that certain lines simply wouldn't be crossed, especially by the two people closest to me. My sister had always taken pride in being admired, and my fiancé enjoyed attention more than he admitted, but I never believed admiration could quietly turn into entitlement. The moment everything changed wasn't explosive or emotional, but disturbingly calm, delivered through a conversation that felt rehearsed. My fiancé told me he needed space, and my sister suddenly became distant, avoiding eye contact while insisting she had nothing to do with it, a contradiction that settled heavily in my chest before I had proof to justify it. When the truth finally surfaced, it wasn't framed as betrayal, but as inevitability, as if their choices were the natural outcome of compatibility rather than a deliberate act of harm. My sister didn't apologize, my fiancé didn't explain, and I was left standing in a story where I was expected to quietly step aside and accept that I had simply been replaced. What they didn't realize in that moment was that losing them didn't leave me powerless, but unanchored, free from expectations I had never questioned before. And while they believed they had taken something from me that couldn't be recovered, the truth was that this was only the beginning of a shift none of us yet understood. The weeks after the engagement ended passed in a blur that felt unreal, as though I were watching my own life from a distance while everyone else moved on far too quickly. My sister stopped coming around entirely, and when she did reach out, her messages were short, careful, and written in a tone that suggested she believed time alone would soften what she had done. My fiancé, who was no longer mine in any sense except memory, avoided direct conversations, choosing instead to let information reach me through other people. I learned they were seeing each other seriously, not from them, but from relatives who assumed I already knew, and each time someone spoke casually about it, I felt the weight of being expected to accept the situation with grace. Family gatherings became tense and strangely transactional, with people choosing sides without ever saying they had done so. Some urged me to move on quietly for the sake of peace, while others insisted that my sister had simply followed her heart, as if that somehow justified what had happened. I found myself shrinking in rooms where I had once felt secure, unsure of where I belonged, now that the future I had planned was no longer mine. What hurt the most wasn't just the betrayal, but how quickly the narrative shifted away from me, recast as a story about new beginnings rather than broken trust. My sister appeared confident and unapologetic, and my former fiancé seemed relieved, as though leaving me had removed a burden he had never admitted to carrying. I tried to focus on rebuilding my own routine, throwing myself into work and avoiding conversations that reopened wounds I was still learning how to carry. It was during this time that I learned my sister had started working at the same company as me, not by coincidence, but through a referral that made it impossible for me to ignore her presence without also disrupting my own career. Seeing her daily forced me to confront the betrayal in a way I hadn't been prepared for, especially when she acted as though nothing between us had truly changed. She spoke to me professionally, politely, and without shame, as if the personal boundaries she had crossed no longer mattered once we were confined to the same office. What I didn't realize then was that this proximity was only the beginning of a new imbalance, one that would soon pull someone else into our lives, someone with authority, influence, and a perspective on both of us that would quietly reshape everything again. Seeing my sister every day at work changed the shape of the betrayal, turning something emotional into something constant and unavoidable. What had once been a personal wound now followed me into meetings, hallways, and shared projects, forcing me to maintain a professionalism that felt more exhausting than open confrontation ever could. She adapted quickly to the environment, projecting confidence and competence, and people responded to her the way they always had, with admiration that came easily and questions she answered smoothly. I kept my distance, focusing on my responsibilities and avoiding unnecessary interaction, even as I became aware of how closely our work paths were beginning to overlap. It didn't take long for me to notice the attention she received from senior leadership, particularly from her department head, a man known for being decisive, private, and intensely focused on performance. He treated her with a formality that bordered on mentorship, while observing me with a quieter curiosity that I couldn't quite place. Our first real interaction came during a project review where we were assigned overlapping responsibilities, and for the first time, I had to present my work directly alongside hers. The dynamic was tense but controlled, and while she spoke confidently, I noticed small gaps in her preparation that went unnoticed until I calmly clarified them without drawing attention to her mistakes. After the meeting, her supervisor thanked me for the clarity and restraint I had shown, commenting that it was rare to see professionalism maintained under obvious personal strain. I brushed it off, not realizing that this moment would quietly shift how I was perceived within the company. From that point on, I found myself included in more conversations, asked for input on decisions I hadn't previously been part of, and trusted with responsibilities that suggested long-term confidence in my judgment. My sister, on the other hand, seemed unsettled by the change, sensing that the admiration she relied on no longer gave her the same advantage it once had. What I didn't understand yet was that while she believed she had secured stability by taking what I lost, I was building something entirely different, grounded not in visibility or charm, but in consistency and trust. And this difference, though subtle, was beginning to draw attention from someone whose opinion carried far more weight than either of us had anticipated. The change didn't announce itself loudly, but I felt it in the way conversations started to pause when I spoke, and in how decisions that once bypassed me now came back for my input. My work didn't suddenly improve overnight, but the consistency I had maintained during months of personal turmoil was finally being noticed by the people who mattered. Her boss, the same man who oversaw both our departments, began requesting my perspective more often, sometimes under the pretense of clarification, other times simply asking how I thought a situation should be handled. He never mentioned my sister or the personal history between us, and that deliberate distance made his interest feel professional rather than intrusive, which I appreciated more than I expected. My sister noticed it too, though she never said anything directly. She became sharper in meetings, more defensive when questioned, and noticeably uncomfortable whenever our roles overlapped. The confidence she had carried so effortlessly before now seemed strained, as if she sensed that the ground beneath her wasn't as solid as she had assumed. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt watching this shift take place. I wasn't interested in competing with her or reclaiming anything she had taken, and the absence of that bitterness made me realize how much I had changed since the engagement ended. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore, not to my family, not to my co-workers, and certainly not to her. The conversations with her boss slowly moved beyond projects and deadlines into longer discussions about leadership, values, and the kind of environment he wanted to build within the company. He listened carefully, asked questions that showed he paid attention to details others missed, and treated my perspective as something worth considering rather than managing. It was during one of those conversations that I understood the real shift had nothing to do with titles or visibility, but with trust. While my sister relied on presence and familiarity, I had earned credibility through restraint, reliability, and the ability to function under pressure without making it anyone else's problem. By the time rumors started circulating quietly through the office, they weren't about rivalry or conflict, but about alignment, about who was being prepared for greater responsibility and who was beginning to feel sidelined. And for the first time since everything fell apart, I realized that the future unfolding in front of me had very little to do with what I had lost, and everything to do with what I was becoming. The moment everything crossed from professional into personal didn't happen at work, but afterward, in a conversation that was careful, deliberate, and impossible to misunderstand. Her boss asked me to dinner under the guise of discussing long-term plans, and I agreed only because nothing about his approach suggested anything other than respect. The conversation stayed where it should have for most of the evening, focused on leadership, accountability, and the kind of decisions that reveal who people really are under pressure. It wasn't until the end, when he acknowledged what he already knew about my past and the dynamic between my sister and me, that I realized this wasn't a coincidence, but a choice made with full awareness. He told me he admired how I handled loss without turning it into spectacle, how I continued to show up without demanding sympathy, and how that kind of restraint was rare in both personal and professional spaces. I listened quietly, not flattered, but cautious, aware of how easily power imbalances can distort intention. What followed was not a confession or a pursuit, but an invitation to step forward without secrecy or urgency, leaving me space to decide without pressure. I said no that night, not because I wasn't interested, but because I needed time to be sure that this wasn't another situation where someone else's choices would define my future. When my sister found out, the reaction was immediate and unguarded, anger mixed with disbelief, as she accused me of crossing a line she believed belonged to her. Hearing that made everything painfully clear, because even now, she framed my life in terms of what it took from hers, rather than what it was building for itself. I didn't respond defensively or explain myself, because I no longer felt the need to compete for understanding. Instead, I chose distance, time, and clarity, stepping away from both the family drama and the office gossip, to decide what kind of life I wanted to stand behind. Months later, when the relationship became public, it wasn't a revelation or a scandal, but a confirmation of something that had grown slowly and deliberately, rooted in mutual respect rather than impulse. I became his wife not as an act of revenge or triumph, but as a result of choices made carefully, with awareness and consent on both sides. What my sister took from me was something fragile, built on attention and convenience, while what I built afterward was grounded in trust, stability, and intention. And in the end, the difference between us wasn't who won or lost, but who learned to stop measuring their worth by what they managed to take from someone else.